Hi, good afternoon and welcome everyone to another Whistle Stop Tour of Tanach session, where today we are going to be looking at Avadhya. Before I begin, I just want to say a big Mazel Tov and happy birthday to the United Synagogue. It really is an honor and a privilege for me to be teaching, and for the United Synagogue, especially on their 150th birthday. Long may they continue with their amazing work. So today we are going to be looking at Avadhya, who is the fourth in our book of Trei Asar, who's the fourth of the 12 prophets that we are looking at in our series here. Again, for anyone who's new to us, please do find the previous sessions on the YouTube channel of the United Synagogue. And we are going to move on today with Avadhya. The source sheet is available for downloading at the United Synagogue's website, and please do be in touch. If you have any questions, you can use the chat on the Facebook stream here as well if you have any questions for me. Avadhya is really fascinating because Avadhya is the smallest of all of the prophets. His book is only one chapter and it's only 21 verses. So we have a really big question to answer today. What can we learn from only 21 verses of this prophet? Secondly, Avadhya is the only one who speaks primarily to the non-Jewish nation of Edom. And he's not really speaking directly to the Jewish people. So we have a second question. What can we gain from this prophecy that's directed to the non-Jewish nation of Edom? So those are our two main questions today. To answer them, we're going to use a threefold structure that we've been using in all our sessions of firstly looking at the context, who is Avadhya and when did he live? Secondly, the content. What is he actually talking about? And thirdly, the concepts. What is his message to his generation and to us today? So part one. When did Avadhya live? What's the context of Avadhya? Like with Yoel that we did a couple of weeks ago, we just don't get any clues as to who our Avadhya is. We don't know. It talks about him being, the opening says Chazan Avadhya, the prophecy of Avadhya, and then it launches straight into his prophecy. We don't get any location, we don't get any kings, we don't get any indication of the time period. So there are two mainstream views that I'm going to share with you about when he lived, because again, we don't know for certain. I'm going to share my source sheet with you so that you can begin to see what we are talking about. The first opinion that I'm going to share with you, sorry, let's go to the top of my source sheet here. The first opinion that I'm going to share with you here is, as seen in the Gemara, that he is the same Avadhya that is seen in the Book of Kings, in Sefer Malachim. We see that our rabbis, our sages, like to preserve biblical personalities. So when we have an Avadhya in the prophets, they want to say it's the same Avadhya that's mentioned elsewhere. Let's see if that makes sense here. Malachim Aleph, chapter 18 of the first book of Kings, you see in source number 1 here, it talks about Avadhya. Who is he? V'yikra Achav el Avadhyahu asher al habayit. This is talking about King Achav. Achav, one of the most infamous kings, known for his wicked ways, his idolatrous wife, Jezebel. Achav and Jezebel persecuted the prophets in the northern kingdom of Israel and really implemented idolatrous practices in all the corners of that northern kingdom. And they have this man called Avadhya. It says here, an Achav called to Avadhya, who was the steward in his house, the steward in his palace, meaning Avadhya had quite a high position in the palace of King Achav. And then we have this sort of parenthetical comment here that I've put in red for you, Avadhya hu haya Yirei et Hashem me'od. And Avadhya was a great God-fearer. Just in case you're worried, oh, he's in the house of Achav, so he must be evil if he's in the house of the wicked king, we're being told, no, actually, he's a great God-fearer. Now, so Chazal tell us that this Avadhya mentioned here in the Book of Kings is the same as our Avadhya of Trei Asar. That would put him quite early. That puts him at the time of Achav, of Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet, who famously battled with Achav and Jezebel, and that puts him quite early on, before even Amos and Hosea, who we've talked about in previous weeks. How do we know this? So let's look quickly. I'm not going to go into it in so much detail, but here in source number 2, the Gemara in Sanhedrin 39b talks about who Avadhya is and compares him to this Avadhya. So equates him, says he is the same personality as our Avadhya that we've mentioned in Kings. And the Gemara here asks 2 main questions. I'll summarize it outside. Let me scroll down so you can see the English here as well. The Gemara asks, who was here Amar Rabbi Yitzchak mipnei ma zacha Avadyahu leneviyah. The first question it asks, why did Avadhya merit to receive prophecy? It's not given to just anyone. What did Avadhya do that was so great? And then the Gemara explains that he risked his life as the steward in Achav's palace. He risked his life to save 100 true prophets of God from Achav and Izebel. As I said, they were being persecuted. He was trying to kill all the true prophets of God, and Avadhya risked his life to save 100. And what did he do? He saved them in 2 separate caves, 50 in one cave, 50 in the other. And the Gemara explains why did he do that? To protect them, just in case one cave was found and then those prophets were caught, there would be another cave that would hopefully escape notice. And it's kind of similar to the idea that I've heard that the royal family don't all take a plane trip together because just in case there happens to be an accident and something, the worst happens, that there should be an heir to the throne of the royal family somewhere alive and safe. And in fact, Yakov did that in Bereshit. We see that Yakov, when he's coming to meet Esav, his brother, after all those years apart, he does the same thing. He splits his camp in 2 so that there's more chance of someone surviving attack if there is going to be an attack. And actually, we're going to come back to the story of Yakov and Esav soon. So it says that, again, Avadhya merited prophecy because he risked his life at the time of Achav by saving these prophets. The Gemara also then asks another question. Here, I've bolded the second question for you here. Why does Avadhya prophesy about Edom? Okay, the question we also asked at the beginning, why is his prophecy only to the non-Jewish nation of Edom? And there are 2 answers given. And one of them, which is really interesting here for us to see, that Avadhya was an Edomite convert, meaning that he himself descended from the kingdom of Edom, and therefore it was fitting for him to prophesy to the nation from where he came. And that's just something interesting for us to think about, that also this information we're given about Avadhya being a convert from Edom. And we see therefore that, again, the Gemara very much puts them together with this early Avadhya in the time of kings, in the time of Achav and Izebel. But there's another opinion. Okay. The other opinion puts Avadhya much, much later. Why? Because he is speaking to the kingdom of Edom, meaning it makes sense for him to have lived at a time that Edom were a threat, were living maybe even in the lands of Israel and causing problems with the Jewish people that would lead the prophet to speak to them and rebuke them for what they're doing to the Jewish people. And this therefore puts him much, much later. I've put for you here on the source sheet that Ibn Ezra, who has said that we don't know, Lo Yadanu Duro, we just don't know when Avadhya lives. However, even Ibn Ezra says he thinks he overlaps with Yirmiyahu, or certainly lives after him. Why? Because there is this mention of rumors that have been heard about Edom. And if you look here to the bottom where I've bolded it for you here in source number 3, the Ibn Ezra says there, Navi Yirmiyahu Yeshayahu va'Amos shehitnabu al Edom. That these rumors he's talking about are the previous prophecies of Yirmiyahu, Yeshayahu, and Amos, who have already prophesied about Edom, which would mean that Avadhya would have to live after those prophets. And as we know, Yirmiyahu was the prophet of the Chorban, the prophet of the destruction of the first temple. Now, interestingly, I'm now going to share with you the second mainstream view that actually Avadhya lived at the time of the Chorban of the first temple, the destruction of the first temple. I think it's quite fitting actually that we're going to spend a bit of time talking about the destruction of the temple at the moment, because we are in the 3 weeks leading up to Tisha B'Av, where we mourn the destruction of both the first and the second temple. So we're going to talk a bit about what that means now. We know that the Babylonians were the kingdom that destroyed the first temple and exiled the Jewish people from the land. However, the Edomites were around as well. How do we know that? In source 4, Tehillim, the chapter of Tehillim 137, which there's a custom to say that during the week before we bench. It talks about our love of Jerusalem. If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let me forget my right hand. It's quite a well-known chapter, and it's actually fascinating and worthy of a shir in and of itself, but perhaps for another time. What do we see in verse 7 there? Zechor Hashem livnei Edom et Yom Yerushalayim ha'omrim aru aru ad hayasod ba. Remember, Hashem, what the Edomites did on the day of the destruction of Jerusalem, that they said, aru aru, raise it to its foundations. Meaning the Edomites, they weren't the ones doing it actively, but they were standing on the side, cheering on, saying, yay, go on, destroy it. Okay, the Edomites egged and urged the Babylonians on, leading to the destruction of the first temple. Okay, and therefore there is an opinion that Avadhya lived either during the destruction of the first temple or just after. And I'm going to show you when we look in the next section soon, we're going to look at some of the actual verses, and we'll see how that actually makes a lot of sense. So just to show you one other opinion here that isn't so much about when he lived, but maybe about what he's talking about. The Radak, another medieval commentator, Rabbi David Kimchi, writes here in source number 5, Kvar pirashnu ki b'chorban bayit sheni hara'u edomim liYisrael. We have already explained elsewhere that the destruction of the second temple was inflicted by the Edomites. So the prophet is prophesying about the future troubles and the future evil that the Edomites are going to do in the destruction of the second temple. Meaning that he's speaking maybe not about what's happening at the moment in his lifetime, but what Edom are going to do in the future. And we know there's a strong opinion amongst our sages that Edom became Rome. And the Romans destroyed the second temple, and that's what we are still sort of mourning the loss of, because we have never rebuilt and regained since the destruction of the second temple. We've never rebuilt a temple. So those are really the opinions that Avadhya either lived early on at the time of Achav and Eliyahu, or he lived much later in the time of the destruction of the first temple. I just want to point out one final idea about Avadhya before we move on, that I came across a really fascinating midrash when I was researching for this. There's a Yalkut Shimoni midrash about Avadhya that says he is the most inferior prophet. Okay? It doesn't explain why, maybe because he was a convert, maybe because he's so short, only 21 verses, maybe it's because he only talks to the non-Jewish nation of Edom. We don't know exactly the reason, but the Midrash says he's the most inferior convert. Okay? But most inferior prophet. However, the Midrash continues to say that he is equated with Yeshayahu. Why? Because Avadhya and Yeshayahu are unique in being the prophets that begin Chazon Avadhya, Chazon Yeshayahu. Chazon means prophecy. This is the prophecy of. It's just one of the 10 words used for prophecy in Tanach. However, the fact that only Avadhya and only Yeshayahu have that word Chazon in their introduction puts them on equal terms. And Yeshayahu is obviously one of the greatest prophets. He has a long book. He's one of the most famous prophets that we know about. Therefore, the Midrash is telling us, even if he comes from inferior background, he is as important and as worthy of our attention as Avadhya. And I think this is a really nice message that we can take with us today, that whatever we might think about someone, whatever we might judge about someone from first glance or hearing about their background or their job or their position in society, we should not judge them. They are just as important as anyone else, because we are all worthy of equal attention and equal importance. Okay, so I just think that's one really nice idea that we can take from Avadhya there. Okay. Now what I want us to do is move on to part 2. our content of Avadhya. Now, what I've put for you on the source sheet is I've divided it into three sections. I haven't brought the whole, I did consider bringing the whole book of Avadhya. It's only 21 verses after all, but I decided that was too overwhelming. And I've brought you key verses from each of the sections. So let's begin. Here we see section A is verses 1 to 9, and it's describing Edom's downfall. So, for example, let's read some of it in English. The number 1 here, let's read the prophecy of Avadhya. We have received tidings from the Lord. An envoy has been sent out among the nations. Up, let us rise against her for battle. Meaning that everyone is going to wage war with Edom. And number 2, verse 2 here, I will make you the least among nations, you shall be the most despised. Your arrogant heart has seduced you, you who dwell in the clefts of the rock in your lofty abode. Again, God is saying, Edom, you're arrogant, and that's going to be your downfall. You're going to be pulled down from your high place, and you will be destroyed. And section 8 continues to describe how Edom will be totally destroyed and there will be no remnant of Edom left on this earth. That's section A. Section B talks about Edom's oppression of Yakov. Now it's interesting, normally you would expect the sin to come first to be followed by the punishment, right? But here we see the other way around, maybe just to put the focus on section B. Normally the central thing is the thing we focus on the most. So by putting the sins that they've done to us here in the middle, it's maybe to focus us on it. Let's look at section B in a bit more detail. It's only 4 verses. 5 verses, let's read it. Verse 10 here. For the outrage to your brother Yakov, disgrace shall engulf you and you shall perish forever. It's interesting, it doesn't say what you've done to the people of Israel. It says your brother Yakov, because we're going to see soon, Edom descend from Esav. And Esav and Yakov were those brothers that we talked about earlier. And therefore, it's more of a brotherly thing rather than between 2 separate nations. We're family. So what they do is even worse, okay? Number 11, on that day when you stood aloof, when aliens carried off his goods, when foreigners entered his gates and cast lots for Jerusalem, you were as one of them. How could you gaze with glee on your brother that day, on the day of his calamity? How could you gloat over the people of Yehuda on that day of ruin? This really sounds like the description I gave earlier of the Edomites standing by the wayside, watching and cheering as the Babylonians torch the city of Jerusalem. Again, the mention of Jerusalem and Yehuda instead of the northern kingdom of Israel, again, also puts it at a later time period after the exile of the northern kingdom that we've talked about in previous weeks. Just one final comment on this section. If you look at the last verse, verse 14, where it describes how could you stand at the passes to cut down its fugitives? How could you betray those who fled on that day of anguish? And we know from other sources that the Jewish people who tried to flee the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem were caught by the Edomites and returned to the Babylonians. So this could be describing that evil that they did, that they stopped anyone who was trying to flee from the war that the Babylonians were waging on Jerusalem. I see here that really this really does put a lot of evidence and proof behind the idea that Avadhya is talking about the destruction of the first temple and therefore living after that time period. But again, we can't know for sure, and what the Chazal said about him living earlier in the time of Achav is obviously a very strong argument as well. Let's just look quickly at section C here. The final section of Avadhya, verses 15 to 21, talks about the future day of God that will see Yakov inherit. Yom Hashem. We've talked about Yom Hashem before, especially when we looked at Yoel. And we see it's described here, okay? Payback time, revenge will come. The people who have sinned will be punished for their sins. And those who serve God faithfully will be rewarded. Okay, so that I just want to show you here that I said where I've bolded it and put it in blue here that I wanted to share with you. It says Kikar of Yom Hashem because Yom Hashem is near. Okay, it's coming. It can come at any moment, and I think again that's a nice message of encouragement there from the people, from God to the people. Okay, so we see those 3 sections here of Avadhya, describing Edom's downfall, describing their sins, and describing the future sort of reward for Israel who serve God faithfully. Just going to take away my source sheet for a moment while we move into section 3, or part 3 of our session today. What I want to now talk about are what the concepts. What does Avadhya teach us? Now, one of the questions we need to ask is, who is Avadhya actually speaking to? Is he speaking to Edom, the non-Jewish nation, or is he speaking to the Jewish people? And I think it's possibly a bit of both. He does speak to Edom even in the second person, as if they are right there in front of him. But he also does seem to be giving a message across to Yehuda. We also need to be clear. Remember what we said in our introduction a few weeks ago. Anything canonized into our Tanach, it's because it has a message and relevance and importance for all future generations, meaning that even if he is speaking to the non-Jewish nation of Edom in his time, the reason our sages put it in Tanach is because it has a message, a Jewish message for us in subsequent generations. So that's what we need to try and figure out. What is he telling us? So I think there's 3 main ideas, 3 main concepts in Avadhya that I want to share with you today. Firstly, he shows us that God is not reigning just nationally, but internationally as well. Primarily, Avadhya is teaching us that punishment will come to those who sin against the Jewish people. It's as if it's a warning to the nations of the world, don't mess with them, I'll punish you for what you do to the Jewish people. But it's also a message to Yehuda, to Bnei Israel, to the Jewish people, perhaps of comfort that you are not alone. God is looking out for you, he's there. And so I think again, so number one, the idea that God is reigning internationally on a global scale. Number 2 is the concept of Yom Hashem, the day of God. Okay, that the day of judgment of the nations of all the nations of the world can come at any moment. And as we talked about with Yoel, that day of God represents judgment and punishment to any sinners, Jewish or not Jewish, remember. Okay, and likewise reward to any of those who are serving God righteously and faithfully. So there's 2 sides to the Yom Hashem. Remember, there's a positive and a negative depending on how you choose to live your life. And so that message comes out here again, but again, it's a message of encouragement, as I showed you, Ki Karov Yom Hashem, because Yom Hashem is near, and therefore a message of encouragement that don't lose hope. It can come at any time, and indeed we are today meant to believe that that's true, that redemption and the final Geula and Mashiach can come at any time. We're meant to be believing that on a daily basis, that it could happen. So the third idea, the third concept that I want to share with you today, we're going to look at in quite a lot of detail. I think the third idea that Avadhya is coming to show us, the main message of Avadhya, in my opinion, is links to the relationship between the Jewish people and Edom, signified by the relationship between the brothers Yakov and Esav, and symbolized later by the Jewish relationship with Rome. Okay, and we're going to try and think about what that means to us today. The Da'at Mikra talks about how the prophecies concerning Edom appear in 10 different books of Tanach. It's clearly, Edom, it signifies something more than just a nation. It's not just about Edom, it's what it comes to represent. And essentially it becomes a symbol of all the nations that have wronged us in the past. Da'at Mikra explains it as the concept of Maaseh Avot Siman Labanim. What has happened to our forefathers represents what's going to happen in the future to us. So what happened to our forefathers, to our Avot, in here? So I'm going to share my screen again with you to show you what happens in Sefer Bereshit, in the book of Genesis. We see the relationship between Yakov and Esav, the sons of Yitzchak and Rivka. Now, even in pregnancy, Rivka already could see that the relationship between her children was going to be complicated. Let's look in source number 6. I've brought for you the verses from Bereshit chapter 25, verses 22. Here we see verse 22. The children were struggling within her. Imagine it's like pregnancy pains in your, but really extreme. And she goes to inquire of Hashem, meaning she asks for prophecy, or it's not clear exactly. There's a whole discussion about what exactly that means, inquiring of Hashem. She goes to ask what's going on with the children in my womb that are arguing and struggling so much. And the answer she gets, the prophecy she receives here in verse 23, where I've bolded for you, is Shnei goyim bebitnech u'shnei le'umim me'amech yiparedu. Okay, it describes that there are two nations within you. Two nations are going to come out of you. Okay, and then it says that the one will be mightier than the other and one will serve the other, already implying that they're going to have a complicated relationship with animosity and troubles between them. Okay. And we see indeed in the Parshiot of Bereshit that talk about Yitzchak and Esav, Esav and Yakov, we see troubles and arguments. They're very different, and essentially Yakov steals the birthright, takes the birthright from Esav. Now, this isn't the time for a discussion about why that was the right thing for Yakov to do, but it ends with Yakov fleeing for his life and going to live for many, many years with Lavan, his uncle. And when Yakov returns after many years with all his children and wives and property around him, he returns to Esav and they repair their relationship, they make up. However, it's never perfect between them. And in fact, in Parshat Vayishlach, when they make up, this book of Avadhya is the Haftarah for Parshat Vayishlach. We're going to talk a bit later why that's maybe relevant. And we see that Esav becomes Edom in verse 7 here. I've shared for you, Bereshit 36, verse 8 says, V'yeshev Esav b'har Seir, Esav hu Edom, Esav settled in the mount of Seir, and he is Edom. Now, it could mean because that's the land of Edom, therefore he becomes the nation of Edom. It's not clear exactly why, but essentially from now on, Edom and Esav are synonymous, they mean the same. So when we talk about the relationship between Yakov, who is obviously the father of the Jewish people, and Esav, who becomes the father of the Edomite nation, we see how this relationship between the Jewish people and Edom is on a sort of national scale, the relationship between these two brothers. Okay? Now, and this continues throughout our history. We see problems time and time again with Edom, throughout Tanach, and our prophets are often talking about him. We saw it last week in Amos, they talk about Edom and so on. So, and even when we get to the Gemara, we get to the Midrashic works of our sages, we see that Edom becomes a new enemy. Who does Edom become now? Rome. Edom zu Romi. Edom is Rome, appears a lot of times, and I've tried to bring you the best example that I could of this in verse source 8 here. I brought you Midrash from Bereshit Rabbah, which was written, in the sort of mid-millennium CE, so we're talking around 500 or so CE. That's when it was written down, where it talks about the phrase, two nations are in your womb. Okay, what does that actually mean? What does it mean? This prophecy that there are two nations in the womb of Rivka when she's pregnant with her sons, the twins, Yakov and Esav. And I'll just share with you, as it says in the English where I've underlined, how does the Midrash explain it? Hadrian amongst the Gentiles and Solomon and Shlomo amongst the Jews. Meaning that the Midrash is saying that those two nations are who? Rome and Israel. Okay, and obviously Hadrian and Shlomo are not contemporaries, they're many centuries apart, but they're perhaps used by the Midrash to show the top leaders of the people, maybe. But I just wanted to show you how the Midrash, and many places in the Gemara, many places in the Talmud, say that Edom is Rome. Okay, and obviously we understand why. I mean, these texts were written down or passed down by people who witnessed the Roman destruction of Jerusalem, the exile of the people, the tearing down of the temple. And even before that happened, Rome actively tried to stamp out Jewish life. They outlawed the teaching and learning of Torah. They outlawed the keeping of many commandments. And they really tried to bring an end to the Jewish religion. So we can understand why Esav, who is seen in quite a negative light in the Chumash, he becomes synonymous with Rome, who caused us such terrible things in that time. On another point, we can obviously, it's hard to see sometimes the historical link between Edom in an area that's today sort of Jordan and Israel. with the founding of the Roman Empire in Europe, it's hard to see how the link's there. Shani Tarragon has explained that actually when the Babylonian Empire fell and the Persian Empire rose, Koresh allowed all the people to return to their homelands and re-establish their autonomy there. And the Edom, she says, instead of going back to where they came from, they decided to go north to the area of, to Europe, where they established their homeland. And in fact, the legend about the founding of Rome, the legend of Romulus and Remus, these children who sort of came out of nowhere and were reared by wolves, who then founded the city of Rome, maybe links there, okay? They came from nowhere. So it could be that we can see that historical truth to that link there. And I should just point out that Romulus and Remus obviously ended negative with Romulus killing his twin Remus and ruling alone, which sort of links back to that sibling rivalry of Yakov and Esav, with Esav wanting to kill Yakov and him having to run for his life. We see perhaps a continuation of that there. This identification of Rome and as Edom continues into the medieval times, and we see from Rashi, we see from the Ramban, we see from a lot of the medieval commentators this constant talk about Rome being this evil nation of Edom, and so on. And again, we can understand that they were living at the times of the Rashi, for example, was living at the time of the Crusades, which was when many Jews were killed by the hands of the Christian rulers at the time, and Nachmanides in Spain in the 13th century, when again the church was causing difficulties for the lives of the Jewish people. And we can understand where they are coming from. But today, what does this mean to us today in 2020? And I want to point out to you that the Radak says in source number 9 here, on Avadhya verse 1, he says something really important for me to point out to you. Eina hayom, I'm reading where it's underlined at the end of the first line, Eina hayom livnei Edom ki ha'amot nitbalbalu. We don't know today who Edom is because all the nations of the world have been mixed up. He does continue to say there, it's underlined at the end, that at the beginning, certainly he says Rome was made up of Edom mostly. But now we don't know. Okay, we can't point a finger and say that nation, they're the wicked nation of Edom. We just can't. And it's not helpful or beneficial to anyone for us to try and do that. I don't like playing the name and blame game. We're not interested in that. Okay? We don't know who Edom is today. So what are we meant to do? I think that Edom represents a concept, not a people, not a nation, but a concept. So we need to see, what is this concept of Edom? And I'm going to show you what I think the nation of Edom represents through this idea of what Rome represented. Okay. There's a midrash, that Rashi quotes in his commentary of Bereshit 26:34. It's the final source I'm going to share with you. This will wrap up in a few minutes after I've finished with this last concept. Rashi says, in Bereshit, chapter 26, it says that Esav was 40 years old and he decided to get married. And Rashi says, why when he's 40 years old? Why is this significant? Okay. And Rashi brings this midrash that says that Esav is compared to a pig, to a swine. Why? And I'll just sort of explain it for you outside, but it's there on the source sheet for you. We know that animals need two things to be kosher. They need to chew the cud and they need to have split hooves. The pig is the only animal that has only split hooves. So externally it looks kosher, but internally it doesn't chew the cud, that's why it's not kosher. So the midrash says that the pig tries to confuse us. Why? Because it's also the only hooved animal that when it lies down, instead of folding its hands underneath, its legs underneath it, it stretches its legs out in front. As if to say, look at me, I've got split hooves, I'm okay. When really it's not. It's as if it's trying to trick us by pretending that it's allowed, that it's kosher. And Rashi says Esav is doing that here too. Because on the outside, he's trying to pretend that he's like his father. I'll get married at 40, just like my father got married at 40. But really, what's Esav spent his life doing? It says here he's been kidnapping women and violating them. He's been committing these immoral acts all his life. He's not like his father who lived a life of morality until he got, and then got married. So he's saying on the outside he's trying to be like his father. He's trying to trick us. He's trying to pretend that he is okay, but really he's not. And I just want to show you this, where it says in the Rashi, just like these are stealing and plundering and pretending to be honorable in how they do it. Now the midrash that Rashi is quoting here actually is referring to the Romans at this time. Okay, that the Romans are trying, are pretending that they're okay. What does that mean? How do the Romans pretend to be okay? So it reminds me of the Monty Python sketch, where they are saying, what has the Romans ever done for us? And as I'm sure lots of you know, there's a group of Jewish rebels organizing a revolt against Romans, and one says, what has the Romans ever done for us? And one by one, they all start mentioning, the baths, the straight roads, fresh water, public order, wine, education, and they all start listing things. And then someone says, but apart from that, what have they ever done for us? And there's actually a similar discussion in the Gemara, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, with amongst others discussing this in Gemara in Shabbos 33b. But the idea is that the Romans pretended it was as if they were doing it for our benefit. They were okay. They were honourable. They tried to trick us. Okay, when really deep down they were trying to put an end to our religion. So I think that's the concept we can take from this today. That the Edom is representing that we should try to be true to whoever we are. We shouldn't let whatever culture there is in our generation, so therefore this works for every generation that might come. Don't let whatever culture is reigning to trick us by pretending to be pure and innocent with its outside appearances being okay when deep down there's all the sort of non-kosher elements. So too, we shouldn't be tricked by the modern day Rome or the modern day Edom into giving up our Yiddishkeit, into giving up our Torah. And I think this links back to the idea of this being the Haftarah for Vayishlach, when Yakov and Esav make up. Why is this the Nevuah about the punishment of Edom? Why doesn't it appear in earlier Parshiot when Yakov and Esav are at odds with each other? Well, I think it's because it's harder when we're friends, when things are friendly, when things are good, it's harder to remember who we truly are. Therefore, this comes when Yaakov and Esav have made up, yet there's still a bit, it's not great. This Nevuah comes to remind us to know to be true to ourselves, even in friendly environments as well. So just to summarize with our chart here, and then we'll finish, we've got the context we don't know exactly, there's no time given, but possibly during the time of Eliyahu or during the time of the destruction of the first temple. The content is that it's a short prophecy regarding Edom and its future downfall as a punishment for its sins against the Jewish people. And finally, the concepts are that our enemies will be punished for their sins against us, the encouragement that the day of God can come, and this message, the contemporary enemies of the generation who try to trick us, that's what Edom represents, and we need to stand firm and true to our heritage. As always, please send any feedback or questions to learnwithpnina@gmail.com, and please do join me next week, where we will look at Yonah, who is the most famous of the prophets of Trei Asar, as we read him on Yom Kippur, but really worthy of our in-depth attention. So please do join us next week. Let me just very quickly check if there are any questions for me to address on the YouTube, Facebook here. Okay, there's no questions, so thank you very much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed, and see you same time next week. Thank you very much.